paradrama tales.
I always believed my husband's role as a stay-at-home. Dad meant loyalty. But I never imagined he'd drive 30 minutes to deliver gourmet chocolates to a school mom I've never even met. That innocent act cracked the foundation of our marriage and left me questioning everything I thought I knew. The day I saw that text, a quiet tremor ran through me. I'd always thought our world was built on openness, but this simple invite felt like a chisel at our foundation. I was juggling deadlines at work when my phone buzzed coffee, sometime from a mom at the school drop-off I barely knew. My heart fluttered surprise because I'd never expected friendliness from someone I'd only waved to in the morning rush. I replied with a polite sure, imagining a carefree catch-up over lattes, and felt a small thrill at the thought of adult conversation beyond toddler tantrums and boardroom battles. But the excitement was tangled with a knot of unease. Why had she reached out to me, and why hadn't I heard about it sooner? I prided myself on knowing every detail of his day, the color of my son's art project, the route Dad took to soccer practice, but here was proof. There were corners I'd never seen. That evening I mentioned her message at dinner, expecting him to smile and say, "Oh, that's nice," and ask if I wanted to meet her. Instead, he shifted in his seat, glanced at his hands and admitted reluctantly, "Actually, I already did brought her some chocolates and cookies." My breath caught. He said it like it was nothing. An afterthought, but the confession dropped in my chest like a stone. 30 minutes to a specialty shop, he explained, because she likes those artisan truffles. My mind raced. The same man who'd insisted I stay late at work so I could have adult friendships had kept this a secret. I forced calm and asked why he hadn't told me sooner. He shrugged, muttered, "I was afraid you might overreact," and his eyes flicked away. In that moment, I felt a fissure of self-doubt. Had I been too trusting, too complacent? Was I missing other signals, small acts that added up to something more than neighborly kindness? The words he left unsaid echoed louder than any explanation he offered, and as I lay awake that night, replaying every hallway chat he'd had, every smile exchanged with other parents, I realized that this innocent-sounding coffee invite was really a warning light. It didn't matter whether his gesture was harmless or not. What mattered was the secrecy, the gap it revealed in our intimacy. Little did I know that innocuous invitation would soon uncover cracks deeper than I ever imagined. That night, after our son was asleep and the house was silent, he dropped the confession like a stone in my chest. He had driven 30 minutes to a specialty chocolatier to pick out artisan truffles and gourmet cookies for a school mom I'd never met. I remember the exact words, heavy with reluctance, staking out their own truth. She mentioned liking those truffles. "I didn't want you to freak out, so I did it and didn't mention it until you asked." His voice was low, almost apologetic, but I felt a surge of shock that overtook the apology, an avalanche of questions flooding my mind. 30 minutes is not a quick errand for a casual gesture. It's a commute, a deliberate investment of time and money, the kind of effort that betrays ordinary friendliness. I pictured him wandering glass cases filled with hand-painted bonbons, lingering over walnut-studded caramels, comparing flavor notes as though he were on a mission. The idea that he'd thought that deeply about this other woman while I'd been at my desk or in meetings cut sharper than any blade. Secrecy hovered around his words like smoke. Had he stopped at a gas station on the way home? Or had he driven straight there from school, drop-off? Why hadn't he mentioned it before? Why wait until he felt cornered? When I asked, his brow furrowed and he mumbled something about not wanting to hurt me, but the words felt insufficient. Gift-giving is a language of care, but it can also be a whispered invitation, a subtle shift in emotional currency that I hadn't authorized. I had always believed trust meant transparency, that our daily lives, especially when it came to other parents, were shared territory. But in that moment, I realized there was a hidden corner of his life. I couldn't enter a private ritual unfolding miles away. The boundary had blurred. Something meant to celebrate connection had instead highlighted separation. I pressed him for details. How often did he see her? Had he texted her after the drop-off? And each answer felt like peeling back layers of my own assumptions. I understood that not every thoughtful act is romantic, but secrecy turns everyday kindness into a suspicion-laced affair. And so, I sat across from him at the kitchen table, the empty chocolate wrappers on the counter like evidence in a case, and I wondered, was this merely innocent neighborliness, or the opening chapter of an emotional betrayal that was only beginning? They say a small gesture can speak louder than words, and psychology confirms it. Gift-giving activates our brain's reward, circuitry releasing dopamine that forges emotional bonds and creates a sense of obligation in the recipient. Studies show that when someone goes out of their way to choose a personalized gift, especially something as indulgent as artisan chocolates, it triggers what researchers call the reciprocity principle, nudging us to respond in kind and deepening interpersonal connection. In the realm of flirting, that dynamic can be especially potent. Gifts become nonverbal love notes, each carefully selected item a subtle invitation to intimacy. I remember reading about this in an article that explained how people subconsciously equate thoughtful presence with attractiveness and genuine interest. It made sense then why I felt my pulse quicken when I discovered those chocolates weren't impulse buys, but specialty truffles chosen on a 30-minute detour. It wasn't just the sweetness of cocoa. It was the extra miles, both literal and figurative, that signaled something more than friendly neighborliness. In my mind, I replayed the scene, him weighing boxes in a glass front case, comparing flavor notes, imagining her delight long before I knew she existed. At its core, flirting is an emotional exchange, small signals that test the waters of attraction. A shared laugh, a lingering glance, and yes, gifts. When those signals are cloaked in secrecy, our brains read mixed messages. The generosity feels genuine, but the concealment plants seeds of doubt. That's why I couldn't shake the feeling that something critical had shifted in our relationship. My husband's effort to hide his chocolate run suggested he knew I'd questioned the gesture, and that awareness transformed a simple treat into a covert emotional transaction. Frameworks for healthy boundaries highlight transparency as a cornerstone of trust. In contrast, secret gifts create a hidden ledger of favors slipping beneath the surface of daily routines. We're wired to notice these slips. Psychologists call it interpersonal vigilance, an evolutionarily adaptive trait that keeps us alert to changes in social alliances. I felt that vigilance stirring whenever I passed the school drop-off line or scrolled past his texts. Understanding the science didn't soothe my worry, it amplified it. If gift-giving can spark romance or deepen connection, then his covert delivery of sweets became a glaring red flag. It wasn't just about the sugar. It was about the psychology behind the gesture and how he'd weaponized it, whether intentionally or not, to build a hidden bond. And the real question wasn't what those chocolates tasted like. It was what they were costing me, my peace of mind and the trust I thought we'd shared. When I asked him to talk, I thought I was being reasonable, just a simple question of why he'd risk our trust for chocolates. Instead, I lit a fuse. I found him in the garage tinkering with my son's tricycle, and I took a breath. I thought I'd need to stay calm. I began with, "I'm worried," but he answered with, "Can we just drop it?" as though my concern were a nuisance. That moment felt charged. His refusal to engage wasn't relief, it was a blockade. I reminded him that marriage means sharing the hard conversations, not burying them under silence. He snapped back, voice tight, accusing me of making a mountain out of a molehill. My chest tightened. His defensiveness confirmed every insecurity I'd tried to dismiss. He shoved aside my attempt at empathy with a curt, "I said drop it. End of story." Suddenly, our kitchen table felt like a courtroom, and I was the only juror allowed to speak. My frustration poured out in a rush. I told him I felt excluded from a part of his life I'd always believed was mine by right, that secrecy creates the very distance he claimed to fear. He slammed his hand on the workbench and told me I was overreacting, his favorite dismissal when empathy felt inconvenient. That reaction ignited the argument. My initial sadness morphed into anger so hot it stung my throat. I called out every half-truth he'd told, every dodge, when I tried to probe deeper. He retaliated by listing my supposed flaws, my long hours at work, my restless heart, and accused me of crushing his chance at harmless friendship. His words stung because they echoed doubts I'd whispered to myself. Was I too demanding, too suspicious? But I refused to let his deflection win. When he finally yelled, "I can't deal with this right now," I saw the gulf between us. The safe space I once trusted was gone. That night, sleep eluded me as I replayed the confrontation. His just drop it demand had done irrevocable damage. It wasn't just words, it was a refusal to honor my feelings. I realized that avoiding uncomfortable topics doesn't preserve harmony. It erodes it, chipping away at the foundation until only cracks remain. And so, instead of letting that moment pass, I made a different choice. I would not drop it. I would demand the respect my heart deserved, because in marriage, drop it should never replace "let's solve it together." I used to think the world outside our front door didn't touch the turmoil within it, but one Friday morning at the school playground, I learned how wrong I was. I was kneeling beside our son's swing set, fastening his shoelaces, when I caught fragments of conversation drifting across the mulch. That stay-at-home dad, always bringing treats to the moms. Cute guy, but kind of flirty, isn't he? And the worst one? Wonder what his wife thinks of all that chocolate. My heart sank. These were parents I waved at every morning, neighbors whose children we'd shared birthday parties with. And now their casual asides felt like verdicts I hadn't even heard being handed down. I watched my husband across the field laughing as he challenged our son to climb the monkey bars, and in that moment he looked like the doting dad I married, but in the eyes of our community he'd already become something else. A label had stuck charming, perhaps too charming. Suddenly, every friendly nod he exchanged with other parents seemed loaded with intention. I caught myself scanning the crowd, wondering if they were watching us too. Judging my own reaction, was I overreacting to harmless banter, or waking up late to the fact that reputation is a fragile thing easily shattered by rumor? It hit me that small communities run on unspoken rules. You don't cross the line between neighborly kindness and emotional flirtation. And you certainly don't keep gifts secret. When you do, everyone notices whether they mean to or not. I remembered reading that social psychology calls this reputational contagion, how gossip spreads faster than fact-coloring people's perceptions, even before the truth has a chance to surface. And there I was, caught in that swirl of half-stories, feeling exposed in a place I'd always considered safe. I tried to approach one of the moms, her name was Karen, on my way out, asking if they'd been talking about us. She looked down at her coffee cup and shook her head, but her silence spoke volumes. The playground, once a haven for playdates, had become an arena of silent stares and sidelong glances. My son tugged at my sleeve, oblivious to the undercurrents, and I forced a smile to meet his, determined not to let him sense the tension. Driving home, I realized that rebuilding trust wouldn't just happen between me and my husband. It would have to happen in public, too. I needed to confront the whispers, not by denying them, but by owning our truth, by walking into the next pickup line together, hand in hand, ready to show that transparency and respect can outlast any label. And I knew that even if the playground eyes lingered, I'd chosen to stand firm rather than shrink behind rumors. Because some reputations deserve to be reclaimed, one honest moment at a time. I didn't notice it at first, but insecurity had moved in with me, like a silent roommate arriving unannounced after that playground gossip and settling into every quiet corner of my mind. I'd lie awake at night, the hum of the refrigerator magnified in the dark, replaying his detour to that chocolate shop and the way he'd brushed off my questions. My chest would tighten each time my phone buzzed, imagining it was another message from Coffee Mom or a new whispered rumor. Mornings became a gauntlet over cereal. I'd catch myself scanning the school drop-off line for her familiar face, a knot twisting in my stomach before the day even began. At work, I'd stare at spreadsheets with fluttering focus, wondering if I was losing my mind. Was I imagining flirtatious looks, or was he really testing the boundaries of our marriage? Trust had fractured so completely that I couldn't tell where my own thoughts ended and his actions began. The kitchen table where we once shared coffee and morning chatter felt like a tension-filled battlefield. Even his smile across the countertop became a question. Do I dare believe this is real, or is it another carefully hidden move? I found myself holding my breath whenever he left the house, counting minutes until he returned, my watch ticking louder than any alarm. My hands shook sometimes, reaching for the doorknob, lifting my son into the car because I was constantly bracing for the next surprise. Friends texted to ask if everything was okay, and I'd force a laugh. Oh, just tired, never admitting that fear had taken up residence in my heart. I caught myself scrolling through our old photos on my phone, searching for evidence of the husband I knew before curiosity and secrecy eclipsed honesty. Each time I scrolled past a picture of us smiling at the park or sharing a slice of coffee cake, the gap between then and now yawned wider. Insecurity doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It seeps in a slow drip that erodes confidence until you question every glance, every laugh, every shared moment. I realized that if I didn't confront this fracture, if I let that anxious roommate stay unchecked, it would hollow out my sense of self and corrode any chance of rebuilding with him. So I resolved to name it, to bring it into the light, the fear of being replaced, the suspicion that kindness could be a veneer for something deeper. Only by speaking it aloud could I hope to evict it and start piecing back together the trust that once made our home feel like a safe place to breathe. It was clear something had to change that night, because tiptoeing around the truth wasn't keeping us close, it was driving a wedge between us. I sat him down at our kitchen table, the same one where "just drop it" had fractured our trust, and I laid out what I needed: transparency, respect, and shared boundaries. First, I asked for clear expectations around outside friendships: no surprise gifts, no solo meetups with other parents without giving me a heads up first. If he wanted to befriend someone, I needed to know who, when, and why, just as he would expect me to tell him about my own social invitations. He nodded slowly and admitted that secrecy had felt easier than conflict, but he understood how it had hurt me. Next, we discussed shared agreements. We drafted a list of no-go zones together. Secret errands were off the table. One-on-one coffee dates with fellow parents would only happen after we both felt comfortable, ideally as family playdates or group outings first. He agreed that sending gifts of any kind should be a joint decision. Impulse purchases meant to please someone else could wait until I was part of the conversation. I reminded him that boundaries aren't walls to keep us apart, but guardrails that protect what we've built. He reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and promised to honor those lines, because he valued our marriage more than any fleeting connection. Finally, we set up regular check-ins every Sunday evening. We'd sit down, no phones, no distractions, and share honestly about our week. Was anything awkward at school? Pickup? Did either of us feel uncomfortable with interactions we'd had? These mini conversations would act like routine maintenance on our relationship, catching small cracks before they spread. He admitted that he'd never considered how a single secretive gesture could spiral into a crisis of confidence, and he welcomed the idea of holding both of us accountable in a safe space. Putting these agreements into words felt strangely liberating. The air between us, once thick with suspicion, began to clear. I could see the relief in his eyes when we reviewed each boundary, as though he too was tired of walking on eggshells. And me, I felt a spark of hope, proof that trust isn't a static gift, but a living promise we renew through action. By defining what was acceptable and what wasn't, we weren't shrinking our world. We were securing it one honest conversation at a time. I knew I needed help untangling the knot of hurt, so I made my first appointment with a therapist who specialized in relationship wounds and betrayal. Sitting in that softly lit room, I felt both exposed and oddly hopeful. Here was someone I could name my deepest fears to: fear of being replaced, fear that my trust was naive, fear that every friendly gesture he made now hid a hidden agenda. In those early sessions, I learned to separate fact from emotional reaction. He had not yet crossed a physical line, but the pattern of secrecy and gift-giving had created an emotional one. The therapist taught me grounding techniques, deep breathing, guided visualization, to calm my racing thoughts, when a stray chocolate wrapper or a school parking lot jogged my anxiety. I journaled daily, charting every time I felt uneasy and noting what triggered it. A text pings after hours, a whispered rumor at the playground, the click of his jacket in the hall. Writing those moments down transformed them from amorphous worries into concrete data I could examine rather than be overwhelmed by. We also explored the concept of micro-covenants, small verbal agreements that build emotional safety. I practiced proposing tiny steps forward, inviting him to accompany me on a coffee run, where we'd meet other parents together, asking him to share his calendar for any one-on-one meetings, suggesting that we pause before agreeing to gift-giving and talk through it first. Each time I raised these ideas at home, I noticed a shift. Instead of defensiveness, his curiosity peeked through. He asked questions about what felt supportive versus intrusive. That gave me hope that change was possible. In parallel, I began attending a weekly support group, listening as others faced their own trust crises: spouses who'd hidden bank accounts, friends who'd betrayed confidences, and finding solace in their resilience. When it was my turn to share, I described my story of chocolates and secrecy, and the group's nods and gentle affirmations reminded me that my pain was valid and my boundaries were justified. Small victories piled up. The first time I told him, "I need to know about your plans with other parents," and he responded with honest details rather than excuses. The first Friday night, I fell asleep without replaying worst-case scenarios. The first time I called a friend instead of spiraling into self-doubt. Therapy, reflection, and those incremental steps became the scaffolding for rebuilding my sense of self and my relationship. I learned that clarity didn't arrive in a flash. It was the sum of mindful breaths, honest conversations, and tiny acts of courage that, taken together, began to heal the fractures in my trust. In the end, I discovered that healing began the moment I reclaimed my voice and honored my own worth when I chose openness over secrecy, respect over resentment, and action over silence. Rebuilding trust wasn't a grand gesture or a single apology. It was the accumulation of small promises kept the courage to speak up when my heart whispered warnings and the humility to listen when his eyes spoke regret. Now, when I drive our son to school and spot other parents in the morning light, I no longer brace for whispers. I greet them alongside my husband, confident in the boundaries we've set and the honesty we've vowed to maintain. Grief taught me that loss can leave scars, but betrayal showed me that those scars can be the very places where strength grows. If you've ever felt torn between loyalty and self-preservation, know that your feelings matter and that setting firm boundaries doesn't push love away. It protects it. Share your story in the comments below to remind someone else they're not alone, and subscribe for more journeys of resilience and renewal. Hit the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore how to rebuild intimacy after life's toughest tests. Because choosing yourself isn't just an act of self-love, it's the first step toward a future where trust can bloom again.